Centuries ago, they gave birth to the legend of a magical, massive giant named Finn McCool.
Finn McCool was a wonderful giant. He was 16 metres tall. He was loved by everybody in this area. People years ago didn't understand how the causeway was made, so they came up with the idea that Finn McCool the giant made it. So he lived here with his wife Una and his son Ashing.
Una McCool, Finn's wife, was not a giant. In fact, she was a beautiful local girl, a typical scenario in many folk tales where the giant is kind.
It is noteworthy that many giants have mortal women as wives. One of the questions is, what happens when giants are not loners? Very often they seek mates as a part of their urge, and when they do, they often are looking to mortal women, often very beautiful mortal women.
The Giant's Causeway is on a piece of Irish land that is only 20 miles across the sea from Scotland. It's the proximity between the two nations and a rivalry that goes back centuries that many believe sparked the story of how the Giant's Causeway was built and destroyed.
One day, Finn was going for a walk and he heard about the Scottish giant Benandonner. And the Scottish giant was showing off, saying he was bigger and better than Finn McCool. And he said he was going to come over here and steal away all of Finn's possessions and take away all of his land. So as you can imagine, Finn was absolutely annoyed about this, completely bad-tempered.
The legend said that Benandonner had begun to build a causeway in order that he could come across and fight Finn McCool and put an end to their rivalry forever. Finn, hearing of this, began to do exactly the same from here in North Antrim. The two met in the middle, and there was a massive fight between the two of them in which the causeway was scattered.
So what we have today is the beginning of the causeway here, the Atlantic Ocean in the middle, and then on the other side in Scotland, in the island of Staffa, we have the other side of the causeway.
Another popular version of the story shows the wit and cunning of Finn McCool and adds a little Irish humor to the dark giant's tale. In this story, Finn builds the long causeway to Scotland to challenge Benandonner.
But so exhaustive was that work that he came back and promptly fell asleep, and was sleeping a fine sleep when the other giant from Scotland decided to come over the causeway. And Finn's wife woke up and heard the giant approaching, and the giant came steaming ashore, crying out, "Where's that coward McCool? I'll battle him now."
So Una came up with a wonderful plan. She was a very clever lady. And what she did was she ordered Finn to get into the cot. She put a little bonnet over his head and he pretended to be the baby.
Benandonner comes across to North Antrim and finds Finn's wife with the baby in the cradle.
"Where's Finn McCool? Where's Finn McCool?" And Una says, "He's left me with the baby."
And he says, "That's a very fine baby." And she says, "Yes, it is." And she says, "He's like his father." Now, this terrifies Benandonner, who says, if the child's like that, what is the father going to be like? And flees, scattering the giant's causeway behind him.
Some even believe one of the massive boulders left behind by volcanic activity millions of years ago is Finn McCool's shoe.
There's a story at the causeway that when Finn was running away from the Scottish giant Benandonner, because he saw that he was far too big for him to fight, he ran so fast that he lost one of his boots. And this boot can now be found here at the causeway, and this is it, the 16-metre giant's boot. We have actually had a forensic anthropologist who has studied the boots and measured the boots and the width, the length, the height of the boot, and has worked out the size that Finn McCool's feet would have been size 95.
The tale of Finn McCool was able to thrive because of the rich tradition of Irish storytelling. But the Emerald Isle is not the only place where legends of giants have taken root.
The tradition of the American tall tale giant is a completely different tradition. Paul Bunyan is probably the best one to take a look at.
Paul Bunyan was a leader of men, certainly larger than life. With one swing of the axe, he could cut 40 acres.
The stories of this rugged individualist gave countless men in a dangerous profession an immortal frontiersman to look up to. You're watching Giants, Friend or Foe, on the History Channel. The legends of giants have haunted mankind since storytellers first told tales.
You can find giant stories in almost every culture. And there's kind of a base myth that links these stories together, and that's the idea that there was an older race. In a time before time, the world was populated by a race of giants, and that when the human race came, they had to do battle with the giants to find their own place in the world.
The rock formations of the American desert Southwest are some of the most massive and remarkable works of nature on the planet. Modern science can explain away these towering boulder tapestries by citing volcanic activity that occurred here 1 million years ago. But to the native people who once walked these lands, these rocks are what is left of a race of giants.
The Pawnees believe that before there were men, there were these race of giants, and there was a great creator, but the giants did not believe in that creator. And as a result, the creator distributed their remains in the landscape as stone mountains and hills.
Obviously, mountains are a big aspect in giant stories, and so many giant stories take place in the mountains. And all we have to do is look around us at the mountains here and see that it would be easy for early man to imagine giants inhabiting these mountains.
But as the American continent became settled and European science could explain the existence of rock formations and other natural phenomena, the legends of giants began to change.
American giants were slightly different to the European giants. The European giants had been very monstrous. But for the settlers in a new world, the landscape itself was monstrous, so you didn't need terrifying giants. What you might need was giants who were benign, who could help you. Big men.
Nowhere was this more evident than in the turn of the 20th century logging camps of North America, where towering white pine trees were just waiting to be cut, in places like Maine, Michigan, and Minnesota. Life in these camps was brutally harsh. Men logged timber during the winter because it was easier for horses to pull sleighs filled with logs on ice rather than on dirt ground. The camps were self-sustaining mini-cities. Everything a logger needed had to be stored or made, because the nearest town was usually 30 miles away.
Working in white pine logging camps was a pretty dangerous profession. You were constantly fighting the elements, you were moving heavy trees, so fear of death was probably on the minds of these jacks.
These people are traveling out in cold climates, cutting down trees, very sharp axes. Once you're hit by an axe, the likelihood that you can get back to a hospital is slim to none. It's a rough kind of life.
As many as 300 camps operated during a winter in Minnesota alone. The difficult work and the extreme conditions were the perfect proving ground, not only for physical strength, but mental escape through storytelling. The character that was most talked about was a mythic figure who was as big as the nation itself.
In the new developing American continent, there were plenty of big men. Now, these were not physically big men, but they were heroes, men who were carving out areas of the new country. And gradually, they began to assume giant status, just as in ancient Europe. Some of the great kings and heroes had assumed giant and superhuman status.
By the early 1900s, the name of only one giant dominated the tales told round the fire in lumberjack bunkhouses: Paul Bunyan. It's believed this Goliath was an amalgam of several backwoods giants whose stories were told in the 1800s.
Paul Bunyan, in the earliest stories, was not a giant. The earliest stories emphasize his cleverality, his intelligence. It's only later that they start expanding and he starts growing as the stories develop.
He starts as a very strong man and becomes an impossibly large man, someone who's responsible really for the creation of all the natural features of the West.
Many of the Paul Bunyan legends fit into the idea of tall tales. There are many of these kinds of giant exploits where the scale is greatly exaggerated. A tall tale characterization of the American spirit, an individuality and an independence.
They find in Paul Bunyan a character who represents them, represents the loneliness, the separation, the feats of strength, and he's impossibly large and impossibly great. He's someone that if there's ever a competition, you can finish the competition by saying, well, you may have finished off 16 flapjacks, you may have cut down a dozen trees today, but you'd never be able to beat Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan represented to the lumberjack, the men who worked in the woods, as somebody who could not be stopped. There was no obstacle, no problem too big. He was a giant, but he was a thinking giant. He was a mental Hercules.
Everything about Paul Bunyan was larger than life. He dragged his axe and created the St. Lawrence Seaway. He could clear a forest in a day.
He's one of us, but he's better, stronger, and more powerful than any of us. People are always involved in these contests of strength, but nothing compares to Paul Bunyan.
If Paul Bunyan could do those things, then you could go out the next day and face the cold. You could face any obstacle that Mother Nature or the foreman or anybody else could throw at you because you were a lumberjack and you were strong.
The stories were meant to bolster the spirits of workers in the logging camps, accenting the camaraderie that was so important to these men. The tales became an instant success. Though Paul Bunyan was known as a rugged individualist who could level a mountain, he was also known for having a kind heart. At his side was his trusted friend, Babe, the blue ox. Even the story of how Paul found Babe is the stuff of heartfelt kindness.
In the winter of the blue snow, Paul saw this little small thing almost frozen to death in the snow, and he picked him up and he held him in his hands. It was a little calf, and this little calf responded to Paul's kindness, and it grew and grew and grew. And he called him Babe because he was small.
When Paul and Babe played, their footprints created the Great Lakes. When Paul wanted a place for Babe to lie down and rest, he cleared all the forests he could see. That's why there's so few trees in North Dakota.
Babe became Paul's best friend, his ally, his major worker to help him move the timber, and became almost as large in life as Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan is probably the most prominent example of these giants that have been associated with American legend. In many cases, they've also entered or were created by popular culture, building on this need of some common American identity.
And though a handful of stories about Paul were told during the first few years of the 20th century, he didn't become truly famous until 1914. That year, an advertising copywriter named W.B. Laffhead wrote a pamphlet for the Red River Logging Company featuring Paul Bunyan. For the first time, Paul and Babe came to life in the printed word, and Laffhead's stories and drawings made them household names.
Laffhead is the one who basically created most of what we think of in terms of Paul Bunyan. He's the one who turned Paul into a giant. He created Babe the Big Blue Ox. And so this is really kind of like the Ronald McDonald of his time. Paul Bunyan was a corporate logo.
It started out slow, but the legend of Paul Bunyan caught on, and within a few years, people all over the country were reading about this legendary figure. And Paul shows up at helping out in the oil fields and shows out on the West Coast, cutting the big redwood trees. And later on, you have Paul Bunyan stamping out 40 acres of forest fire in one shot.
There is a real difference in the way modern people tell these stories. In a way, we're mimicking the stories of the past because there's resonance for us. We enjoy those stories. We enjoy the idea of thinking that Paul Bunyan created the Great Lakes. It's fun to think of it, but we don't need it anymore in the same way that primitive people needed these stories to explain natural phenomena.
At the Forest History Center in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, the memory of Paul Bunyan has never faded. Here, volunteers struggle to recreate the harsh conditions of the North Woods logging camps.
Oh, well, that hand belonged to Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan became the darling of songwriters who penned wild tales of the giant and how his mighty acts changed the face of the nation. The soundtrack that keeps the work moving is gleaned from the pages of the past, when lyrics of Paul Bunyan's deeds helped inspire loggers during the long, frigid winters.
Inside all the lumberjacks, I think there's a little bit of Paul Bunyan. And Paul Bunyan didn't die. Paul Bunyan lives on. Unlike a lot of our folk heroes, our giants, when you hear the distant thunder, that's not thunder, that's Paul Bunyan and Babe. They're playing, they're romping up there. They still exist in our minds and our hearts.
Across the Northwest, stories of Paul Bunyan continue to fascinate and entertain, while another legend emerged in the East.
John Henry can hold two 10-pound hammers, one in one hand, one in the other, and single-handedly drill through a mountain. There's no dynamite necessary.
He carried the hopes and dreams of the American working class, overcoming impossible odds. You're watching Giants, Friend or Foe, on the History Channel. With the swing of a sledgehammer, he carved himself an indelible place in American history. He brought down mountains and built railroads. He died for what he believed in and became a giant among men. His name was John Henry, working class hero. In the songbook of American folk music, few characters have had more than a dozen ballads written about them. But John Henry, a mythic man turned giant, has more than 100 songs detailing his exploits.
John Henry was a steel-driving man. He died with a hammer in his hand. That's the way that the story works. The legend is that John Henry is a hammer man, drives a sledgehammer, hits a drill, tunneling through a mountain. A group of engineers come along with a steam drill. The steam drill, they say, is going to outperform John Henry, and John Henry challenges the engineers with the steam drill to a race.
It speaks especially to the conflict of industry and the displacement of humans.
The legend of John Henry was born in the mountains of West Virginia in the decade following the American Civil War. Railroad lines were being carved from the landscape, and there were not enough laborers to do the difficult jobs. In many instances, inmates from prisons near the new rail lines were commandeered to do the toughest and most dangerous work. One of the worst jobs on the railroad was building tunnels, pounding holes in a mountain and then blasting it with explosives.
It's terrible work. Its idea was that you'd drive a kind of hole about 4.5 inches wide, a pilot hole into the side of the mountain, put dynamite in it, and explode it. And so these people are moving through a tunnel with lots of sand and microscopic bits that they're inhaling then. Lots of the folks that are building the Lewis Tunnel, for example, all the convicts, there are 400 of them. 40 of them die in 1871, 40 of them die again in 1872. It's deadly work.
In the post-war South, many slaves were freed, only to find themselves forced into a different type of bondage, put in prison on trumped-up charges. Legend has it that one of these convicts was named John Henry, whose brawny strength made him a natural for the tunneling jobs on the railroad.
There was a real John Henry. In the 1870 census, he shows up in the Richmond Penitentiary. First name John, last name Henry, born in New Jersey, and ended up, like so many black men in Virginia, in this criminal system. And he's shipped to the Lewis Tunnel for construction.
Despite all the free labor, railroad owners saw the way of the future not in the strength of men, but in the power of machines. A new machine was brought in that many believed could bore a hole faster than the men working on the railroad. The prideful John Henry challenged the engineers from the railroad company to a race, him against the steam drill.
Lifting his 9-pound hammer, John Henry said, "Show me the machine. I can beat it." Competition was arranged between the two of them.
John Henry was actually able to work faster than the steam engine, but he was so determined to defeat the machine, he collapsed from exhaustion and fell to his death.
John Henry's heart cracked, and he collapsed. After completing a feat of supernatural ability, superhuman ability, John Henry became a legend because he had died beating the machine and showing the triumph of the human spirit over the mechanized world.
Remember, this is right after the Civil War. A lot of the discussion about black men tends to be that they're lazy and that they don't work hard enough and these sorts of things. And here's a story about a man who works terribly hard, so hard, in fact, that it kills him. So that's part of the reason, I think, why the story catches on, why people pass that story about a strong, powerful man like John Henry.
The tale of John Henry lay dormant for several decades until the early 1920s, during the Harlem Renaissance, when black writers were looking for heroes to turn into giants.
Sterling Brown writes poetry about John Henry. Zora Neale Hurston travels through Florida picking up stories about Moses and about John Henry and how great and powerful John Henry is. Fred Becker is an artist who draws these wild, they become steel engravings of John Henry with one arm is an octopus and another arm is a freight train. He's a powerful, powerful man who goes through hell and climbs back out again. And so in the Harlem Renaissance, he goes from being a little bit sad song into a powerful and strong and virile man.
It shows a giant of a man, a superhuman man, which American giants became.
In the 1930s, he grew larger.
He has become politicized because of the idea of a worker who is oppressed by the industrial corporate system.
He becomes a perfect symbol for the Communist Party. Here's a powerful man with a sledgehammer who's fighting against the capitalist machine right beside him. John Henry becomes one of the ways in which the Communist Party is pointing to its working class roots.
There's a giant who they call John Henry, stood taller than a railroad tree. Though he come from smaller beginnings, he's still taller than a UN.
Songwriters of the time took advantage of the historically rich stories about John Henry and of the men who died building the nation's railroads. One famous ballad ends with a line that for years had stumped historians.
A lot of versions of the song end. They took John Henry to the White House and they buried him in the sand. And every locomotive that comes roaring by says, "There lies a steel-driving man." It's an odd way of ending a song. It's kind of peculiar that John Henry was so important that he was taken to the White House, and there's no railroad at the White House, and there's no sand really at the White House. It just doesn't make that much sense.
But in doing research for a book on John Henry, author Scott Nelson came across some photos of the old Virginia penitentiary, from which many railroad workers were recruited.
I'm looking at the picture of the Virginia Penitentiary, and I'm humming the song, wandering around the house, and I sing the last bar of the song, and I look at the Virginia Penitentiary. There's a huge White House. There's a railroad running by it, and there's sand all around it.
The penitentiary was torn down in 1990. During excavation, a mass grave for prisoners was discovered between a large white house and the railroad tracks.
The place where they found the bodies was right next to the old White House, the Richmond Penitentiary, near where the railroad ran by, buried in boxes, piano-sized boxes, 5 or 6 men at a time, with layers of sand beneath each one of the boxes. They took John Henry to the White House. They buried him in the sand, and every locomotive that comes roaring by says, "There lies a steel-driving man." It was a chilling and strange story.
Bury me in that White House sand. Bury me in that White House.
No one will ever know what happened to the real-life John Henry, but one thing is certain, his legend will never die.
If you've ever walked through a railroad tunnel, there's often water in the tunnel, and you can hear the water, and it sounds like a monster. Imagine people talking about that sound and saying, "That's John Henry. John Henry's not dead. You can still hear him hammering. That sound that sounds like a monster, that's John Henry."
The legend of John Henry continues to echo throughout the land, not only in the train tunnels he bore into mountains, but in the hearts and minds of those who believe the strength of the human spirit is still the strongest power on earth. You're watching Giants, Friend or Foe, on the History Channel. In a small country cafe nestled in the hills of northern France, a storyteller weaves wild tales of the region's mysterious past.
The Ruses were the largest giants in the whole world, but they were very unhappy where they were. So they decided to take a trip around the earth. For the trip around the earth, they would take clumps of earth. And why clumps of earth? For a trip around the earth? This story is a little too down to earth, so let's do it again.
One of the best love stories he tells is how his town named Cassel came to be. There are 2 large hills that make up this village, and locals have an explanation of how the hills got there. It is said that the land formation is what's left of 2 giants who fell dead here hundreds of years ago. Northern France and most of neighboring Belgium are the stomping grounds of age-old giants. To the people living in this region, giants are more than just fictional characters to be celebrated. It's tradition to hoist a glass of some of the finest beer in the world, which happens to be named after giants. In fact, throughout the region, the image of giants are woven into the fabric of nearly every aspect of life. In the town of Ath, Belgium, called the City of Giants, people continue to celebrate the region's storied relationship with the giant kind.
The giants phenomenon in Ath is very old. It started with procession in the Middle Ages, and then it's still alive today, which isn't the case in other towns.
The custom of honoring giants by parading them in processions began in the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church started the tradition in the 15th century as a way to teach people religious stories.
It was first religious ceremony, so church wanted the people, the population, to learn something about the Bible, and it was a good medium. They had a procession with various topics about the Bible.
Some say the festivals began as a way to worship multiple gods.
Many of them are fertility gods, and processing them and showing them to the people ensures a good harvest.
The history of the town's giants is as colorful as the stories they depict. More than once, the giants have been threatened with destruction during horrific wars. During the French Revolution, when the governments of both France and Belgium were under attack by revolutionaries, many of the giants were set fire and destroyed.
The giants had to be built again because it was really the heart and the history of the city, so the French could burn it, but it wasn't It was just a few years. Then they built it again because the giants belonged to the city.
Following the fires of the revolution, the people of Ath changed their view of giants. The behemoths became guardians of the town, not religious symbols. Processions continued unabated until World War II, when once again the giants were in danger of being destroyed, this time by the Nazi occupation of France and Belgium. The Nazis did their best to outlaw the region's love of giants in an effort to curtail local traditions. But the people's love for their giants somehow managed to survive. Even under occupation, school children in Belgium would put together mini processions of their giants. In the years following the war, the love for giants in Western Europe grew even larger. Today, giant processions are major events that attract thousands of people. For those in Ath who are part of bringing the giants to life, being involved in animating these creatures is a big honor.
The people working for the giants, who dress them, they are very proud to prepare them or to carry them. It's really an important part of their own family.
Many hours of preparation go into every aspect of these handmade giants. The face is carefully formed from clay. A wicker basket is fashioned for the base, with straps inside so a man can carry the giant. Clothes for the giants are chosen based on their personality and character, which range from soldiers and politicians to dancers and blue-collar workers. Usually, one man carries a giant through the town, though getting him into one of those rigs can be a bit tricky. A team of carriers takes turns moving a giant on the streets, while the sounds of marching bands thunder off the walls of centuries-old buildings. One of Ath's most popular giants is Goliath, from the Bible story. There's a duel between David and Goliath that is depicted when a young boy from the town attempts to throw a beanbag through a small opening in the giant.
In the Bible story, Goliath is very bad. He was defeated by David. So on the Saturday here, you also have a duel between Goliath and David, and everybody hopes that David will win. If David wins, then Goliath starts to dance, and everybody is quite happy about it.
But the following day, the giant story is transformed. Instead of Goliath being a pagan champion of the Philistines, he's a symbol of the town's adoration of their giants.
The next day, there is the wedding, and that's really a feast. Goliath has a wife, and everybody is very happy, is getting married, and there's a whole ceremony. So it's not the Goliath of the Bible then. It's somebody else. He symbolizes the city of Ath.
Year after year, people from all over Western Europe pack the city to see the processions, carrying on a tradition they say will most likely live for another 500 years. Around the world and well into modern times, icons and images of famous giants not only taught important lessons, but had the power to sell canned peas.
Ho, ho, ho. Green Giant.
You're watching Giants, Friend or Foe, on the History Channel. Giants. In the modern age, they conjure up images ranging from monsters at the movies to advertising icons that sell canned peas. But the real-life counterparts of fictional giants are perceived in much different ways than what is seen on film and television screens. Since the age of photography began, images of real-life giants have been well chronicled. Considered by most people to be nothing more than circus freaks, life for those who resembled giants in fairy tales was never easy.
In early days, life must have been pretty awful. They were regarded as freaks. They were regarded as people to be feared. They were regarded as great curios. So I would assume that life, even for a modern giant, would be painful and pretty awful.
One person who suffered in this existence was Robert Wadlow. He was born in 1918 in Alton, Illinois.
I'm Robert Wadlow, 12 years old, and weigh 240 pounds, and I'm about 7 feet tall.
As an adult, he stood 8 feet 11 inches, which makes him the tallest person in the history of the world. An overactive pituitary gland was the cause of Wadlow's huge size. Because he was so tall, his life was difficult, but he was always friendly and willing to talk about his height. The locals in Alton nicknamed him the Gentle Giant.
By all accounts, he was a genial sort of fellow. But I also gather that he was given to periods of Great Depression, and he was actually living in great pain because of the bone ailments from which he suffered. And I suspect Wadlow himself would have suffered from a slight curvature of the spine, which made it very difficult for them to sit in a chair like this and be comfortable.
Wadlow died in 1940 at the age of 22. Because his pituitary gland was heating his body like a blast furnace, he was unable to fight off an infection. The challenges faced by Robert Wadlow still afflict people of extraordinary size today. Though he is the child of normal-sized parents, George Mureshyan is 7 feet 7 inches tall. Like Wadlow, Mureshyan's height is the result of an overactive pituitary gland.
Sometimes I grow over the summer, I grow like 6-7 inch. And when I go back to the school, my friends say, "Man, over the summer you grow so much."
Giants of today are stars in places like the National Basketball Association and can make millions in product endorsements. Mureshyan is no exception. He was one of the tallest players to ever wear a professional uniform, playing professional basketball in both Europe and the United States.
When I start to play basketball, I start to feel normal because everybody was tall, and I don't feel I was tall. I feel I was just a normal player.
His size also brought him fame on the silver screen when he played opposite Billy Crystal in the movie My Giant.
Billy Crystal saw me when I got drafted in 1993. And when he see me in the draft, he said, "This is the guy who can play my script." For me, it was something exciting. It was very exciting.
But the realities of being nearly 8 feet tall can at times make negotiating through a normal-sized world a challenge. And though he dwarfs his average-sized son when the pair goes grocery shopping, Mureshyan says the people in his town accept him and appreciate him for who he is, and for being a giant.
There are some short people, there are some tall people. Not everybody's normal, everybody has something different.
Though giants like Mureshyan have found ways to live normal lives, the images of fictional giants continue to be used for shock value by storytellers in the modern age of film and mass media.
Certainly in modern-day films, giants have gone back to their medieval personification. They're menacing, they're a nuisance. Again, they're the very sort of thing that mankind has to overcome. And indeed, again, we're going back to this personification of a challenge that mankind, using his ingenuity, his bravery, his courage, can eventually defeat.
Modern films continue to mine tales past and present of the giant kind. Because just like storytellers of old, giants come with built-in fears common to us all.
We can look to popular culture and see in films instances where there are still mysteries that have to be worked out, and giants become symbols for that.
They have become subjects of B-movies. Attack of the 50-foot woman. They're coming to destroy our ordered world and coming to destroy our civilization.
During the 1950s, with so many of the films that create giants out of ordinary circumstances, they occur as a result of nuclear disasters. At a time of fear of what the effect of our own science has been, this was a very common theme. Today, in addition to nuclear disaster or radiation, we also see such themes being used around artificial intelligence, or sometimes even UFOs, or alien beings that come in as giants that need to be defeated from ordinary wits, or of finding a particular weakness in those giants.
Giants are most often employed as the ultimate boogeyman, inherently mindless, evil creatures whose only purpose is to destroy the earth and humans. But making giants appear real is not easy. This was especially true during the 1950s and 1960s, when giants first became pop culture icons on the silver screen. The man credited with taking the image of giants out of the pages of storybooks and giving them a realistic portrayal in films is Ray Harryhausen. Harryhausen's skills as a filmmaker helped combine live-action actors with specially photographed giants. Though this was the age of space aliens and the Cold War, many of Harryhausen's giant stories were set in the world of ancient Greek mythology.
I've always been attracted to the outrageous, the giant size. And that's why Greek mythology appealed to me, because the Greeks always thought the gods as just enlarged people like themselves. And they always pictured them as simply giant people living up in Mount Olympus.
Many of his films, which used state-of-the-art technology, such as optical printers, are considered classics. In the film Jason and the Argonauts, Harryhausen created an intimidating-looking creature called Talos, a metal statue on a rampage.
This is a model of Talos. It's made of fiberglass, but it was made from the same mold that the original model. I had to make him jerky, and I got criticized for that as having some jerky animation in the picture. But he was made of metal, and I felt that he should look, not too smooth in his walking, because he's not used to walking a bronze statue.
But pop culture images of giants have been used for more benevolent purposes. For example, one of the most famous uses of a giant has nothing to do with wicked images and mass destruction. He's known as the Jolly Green Giant, one of the world's most recognizable advertising images.
Giants are used in popular culture, for example, in advertising campaigns, perhaps the most famous example being the Jolly Green Giant.
Who can resist? Ho, ho, ho. Ho, ho, ho.
Green Giant.
He was born in 1928 when the Minnesota Valley Canning Company put his image on the side of a can of extra-large green peas. The company eventually changed its name and became known as Green Giant Foods. The image of the Green Giant was known throughout the world.
They live in a valley in which corn grows all the time, and they harvest it, and display the fruits of their labors to yourself and allow you to buy it.
Giants often appear in advertising because they seem to show the huge scale and sometimes appeal of the product as a result. Giants also indicate that the product can be magical because of our association with this oral tradition.
But even the Green Giant was not always considered so jolly. When designers first tested his image in the late 1920s, they found that the giant was too ominous looking. To make him more likable, his face was softened, and he eventually became the smiling, happy giant that he is today.
It's a colossal figure, but it's a memorable figure, and I think that's the point of them to the popular culture.
Ho, ho, ho.
You see a giant, you remember a giant.
Despite a few smiling faces, most of today's images of giants are from the dark side. villains that lurk inside our souls, exploiting deep-seated fears we've carried since childhood.
Giants are figures of dreams, and children dream about giants. I know that I myself, when I was about 5 years old, I had a recurring nightmare of a 2,000-foot lion. I think giants represent our fears sometimes in our dreams, and it's natural that out of those dreams come stories of giants.
Giants are the personification of all the problems that mankind must overcome in this hostile world. And often it's a very ordinary person. Take the story of David and Goliath. If you notice with that story, David is very small, Goliath a titan, and yet David, with his ingenuity, is able to overcome the titan Goliath. Jack the Giant Killer. Jack is an ordinary boy, and yet his ingenuity, his quick-wittedness means that he can defeat the giant. The moral is there is nothing, no problem that we cannot overcome with our courage and our ingenuity.
Despite some who scoff that tales of giants no longer have a place in a modern world, those who study the stories say there will always be a home for the giant kind.
One thing we can't escape is death, and giants question our own mortality. And so I think you're going to see stories about giants persist a long time, as long as people are born, grow up, and die.
It's interesting, of course, how many characters from history become perceived as giants, and perhaps we can explain that with a modern example. One of the things that people often say when they meet Hollywood actors or rock stars is, oh, he's a lot shorter than I thought he'd be. And if you think back to the distant past, of course, our ancestors hearing these stories of King Arthur, of Robin Hood, and the great things that they can overcome. So, of course, in their consciousness, these people are being perceived as giants. And perhaps if they were to meet Robin Hood, King Arthur, even Jack the Giant Killer, they might, in whatever the dialect of their day was, say, ooh, that King Arthur, he's a lot shorter than I thought he'd be.
They still maintain the power to terrify us, but also they still retain the power to make us curious and buy whatever products they come to offer.
They are tales that have captivated us for centuries, superhuman forces beyond explanation.
We all have giants we have to conquer, and I think that will always be true of the human race.
They are the shadows in the night to be feared, and the last hope in dire circumstances. They have prowled the earth since time began, and will continue to stalk us until the sun sets for the final time on the land of humans and giants.